Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wednesday, August 5th, in the 18th week in Ordinary Time for our liturgical year. I had the great blessing of attending graduate school in New York City, and I was studying theology, and one of our professors challenged us about not just letting our studies be simply an intellectual pursuit, but a pursuit that was also of the heart. And so one day in class, he asked, do you know what is the easiest way to become invisible in New York City? He said, take a styrofoam cup and sit out in front of the school on Broadway and 116th. We all knew immediately what he meant, that as you walk the streets around our school, there was no way to miss the poor and homeless folks asking for money. And we all knew that there were times when we had simply walked past them, simply ignoring them. And our professor was challenging us to remember that everything we learn in the classroom must somehow help us relate to the realities of the world outside that classroom and how we would choose to respond to those realities. So I'd ask that you keep that story in mind as we listen to today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew. At that time, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman of that district came out and called to Jesus, "Have pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he didn't say a word in answer to her. His disciples came and asked him, "Send her away, for she keeps calling out after us." He said in reply, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But the woman came and did him homage, saying, "Lord, help me." He said in reply, "Is it not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs?" She said, "Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters." Then Jesus said to her in reply, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that hour. So that's not an easy gospel to listen to, and it makes me think of another thing that a different professor said to us in response to this passage. People like the idea of Jesus being both human and divine until he acts just a bit too human and makes us feel kind of uncomfortable. In this passage, both Jesus and the disciples don't come across in the most flattering way. In fact, they act much as I described in the story I shared earlier when living in New York City. They pretty much were trying to ignore her, hoping she would go away. I think it's helpful to know that the area of Tyre and Sidon that is mentioned, it says where Jesus withdrew to, is about 50 miles away from where Jesus and his disciples normally were in Galilee. And I, just for fun, looked up Philadelphia from Belmead is like 53 miles. So Jesus and his disciples walked that far. This region was outside of Galilee, and those who lived in that area were for the most part not Jewish. They were considered unclean because they worshipped pagan gods, and they were considered beneath them and their enemies. Now, all of this Jesus, of course, knew before he set out for that region. So why would Jesus go there? And what does this encounter with the Canaanite woman mean? So as you can imagine, there are many different interpretations of this scripture passage and are far too detailed to get into in this video. But in one of my classes in grad school, as we talked about this passage, a professor offered an interpretation that has so stayed with me all these years. And I just want to share that with you. And I'll offer a paraphrase of what she had shared with us. So it's something like this. What if there really is no way to make this passage sound nicer in terms of how Jesus and the disciples treated this woman? What if Jesus was simply tired and worn out from the confrontations he had been having with the Pharisees? Kind of the stubbornness of heart of the Jewish people in responding to his message. And honestly, the threats that were being made against his life. What if he was worn out by all the people who had been coming to be healed by him? And we know from the scripture passages right before this one and then after, there are two big scenes of Jesus feeding the multiplication of the food, where one is 5,000 people and another is 4,000 people. So, maybe he just needed to really get away from the crowds a bit and rest and recharge his batteries, so to speak. So he goes away to this region where he figures really no one's going to know him and he can just kind of take a breath. But lo and behold, someone does recognize him, and she comes out asking that he heal her daughter. And what if, hearing that reply, being so tired, Jesus and his disciples just kind of ignore her. Like, I can't deal with one more request. I can't deal with it. And they just walk on trying to ignore her. But she's persistent. And she's willing to be called names. And she's willing to be pushed aside and treated in a very, very rude way. Because she'll do anything to try to help her daughter. Now, as much as can happen to us, right? Just when we don't want to be bothered with something or someone, something happens. Or someone comes along and jolts us out of ourselves. I don't know about you, but that's happened to me. And in that instant, that person or that situation challenges me to remember who I am and those things that I value and how I'm called to be and how I'm called to treat others. And my professor kept pushing and saying, what if that happened to Jesus in this passage? What if amidst all of his fatigue and exhaustion and worry, this woman comes along and challenges Jesus to remember that all people, not just Jews, are children of God. She reminds him that every person is deserving of at least a scrap of food and to not be simply tossed away as unimportant. What if, in that moment, when Jesus is running on empty, she helps him discover a deeper call in his life? That his heart and the heart of God are wide enough, large enough to welcome all people, even those we may have least expected to welcome, or maybe even those we may not like. We know by the end of the story that something shifts in Jesus, and in fact, he heals the woman's daughter. When at first he wanted to ignore her, he then sees her as a person and is moved to help her. In this interpretation that I just offered, the challenge that is given by this woman to Jesus is our challenge too, right? We live in these times in which there's much that can wear us out. It's understandable if we kind of just want to go someplace and be left alone and not be bothered and get away from the pandemic, from all the divisive politics, from the protests, from all the divisions. It's understandable where you could just be like, I'm just done with this. But I think that this passage, at least for me, calls me to pay attention to those very interactions and those experiences that annoy me or frustrate me or confuse me. And instead of just blowing them off, maybe it's a time for me to discover something anew within myself. In the very messiness of life, there's a lot to be learned. And if Jesus can stop and learn something new within him, so can we. Just when we think we might have it all figured out, someone comes along, something happens, and we realize that our hearts are bigger and more generous than we thought, capable of welcoming more people and willing to learn something new. So I hope that that's our prayer for today, to keep our hearts wide open. I continue to pray for you and all your loved ones, and we continue to pray together as a parish family for the many ways our world is just so wounded at this time. And may others find in us a place of peace and a place of hope.